Boldwood presents One Winter's Night, written by Kate Frost and read by Laura Kerman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Echoes of the past whispered around Molly as she walked through the house she'd grown up in. Any sense of it having been their family home had slowly been erased over the last year as her parents' belongings had been sorted and the furniture removed, leaving the rooms bare. Along with her thoughts, only her footsteps scuffing the flagstone floor and the wind rattling the single-glazed window panes kept her company. Memories filtered in and out as she wandered, trailing her fingers across the cold stone fireplace in the living room. She imagined the blast of heat from the flames devouring logs. It had been years ago when Christmas stockings had hung above the fireplace and the excited chatter of her nephew and niece, Finn and Alda, had filled the place. Winter sunshine streamed through the dining room window, too weak to take the chill away. Molly shivered as she stood in the middle of the room, the ancient stone floor fully visible now the table was no longer there. It had been where countless birthdays and anniversaries had been celebrated over big family meals, when laughter had filled the room, a sound that had been missing for too long. With the fire unlit and only the picture hooks left on the walls, everywhere looked sad and drab. She perched on the window seat and looked out over the lawn. The single glazing let in wisps of icy air, and the grass and shrubs were covered with frost. They'd had a garden party out there for her sister Claudia to celebrate her moving to Iceland. It had been a perfect September day on the cusp of autumn, with drinks and nibbles set up beneath a white marquee. It was hard to believe that was nearly 25 years ago. Much had changed, both in this house and with her family. Now the borders were overgrown with brambles twisting through the ceanothus. Her mum would have been horrified. When she'd been well, she'd been out there in all weathers, sun hat and shorts in summer, woolly hat and well-worn Burberry body warmer in winter. Everything had been neat, tidy and contained. It had been the same inside too. She'd been house-proud and had the time to keep on top of everything. A large, drafty Grade 1 listed house could have felt cold and unsettling, but she had turned it into a warm and inviting home. Molly didn't want to entertain sad memories, but it was hard not to. She'd been building up to this day for months, desperately wanting to be rid of the stress involved in probate, going through the will, selling the house. The whole process had been long and drawn out. Much of the past year spent dealing with the house sale, going through her parents' belongings, sitting through video calls with her sister in Iceland, trying to work out what should be kept, chucked, recycled or sent to charity. They'd kept very little. There was only so much Molly could take back to the 3-bedroom townhouse in Cheltenham she shared with her boyfriend Howard, particularly as he rolled his eyes every time she returned with a bootload of stuff. Most things had been stored away in the attic, along with some of the things Claudia wanted but needed to organise getting shipped to Iceland. It had been emotionally exhausting, stripping Ashford House of everything that had made it a home. Even if she could afford to keep the place, it wasn't somewhere she could live, not with the memories. Not that Howard would want to live here either. He preferred clean lines and a modern look. They'd compromised over their Georgian townhouse, blending modern with the period detail she loved. Keeping this house would never work. A clean break from the past was what she needed, even if she didn't feel that way right now. The last couple of years had been filled with constant change and upheaval, leaving Molly feeling as if she was running from one crisis to another, her insides in turmoil. She was desperate to escape, for time to pause, to allow her to get a grip on her emotions. But of course, life wasn't like that. When she was down, something else inevitably happened to send her spiralling further. Molly shivered and pulled her forest green coat tighter around her. With no heating, her breath steamed white into the air. She stood up, feeling the need to move and keep warm. She'd do one last sweep of the house and then leave. It was time to let go. Later, a new family would be moving in to create their own memories, breathing new life into the place. It was just a house, she tried telling herself, not a home any longer, and yet sadness curled around her. She had this desperate need to hold on to the place she loved, that reminded her of happier times despite the last couple of years having been threaded with heartache. It was the finality that upset her the most. Being here made her focus on the reality of her loss, while her coping mechanism had been to try not to think too hard about it all. As she headed upstairs and poked her head into the damp bathroom, she acknowledged that however hard it was to let go, she couldn't cling to the past. The memories of her parents would remain, yet there was something about no longer being in their home that tugged at her heart. Claudia, more practical and less sentimental, would tell her to pull herself together. But Claudia wasn't here. She wasn't the one who'd had to deal with all of this on a daily basis. The sound of Claudia. It was as if she somehow knew Molly had been thinking about her. She forced down a sigh, pushed open the door of her old bedroom and answered, "Hi, Claudia. Hey, are you at the house?" "Yes, just checking the place and walking round one last time." There was a pause. Molly drew back the curtain and peered past the condensation at the garden view she'd grown up with. She caught sight of her reflection, her long chestnut-brown hair, now straightened rather than wavy as it had been in her childhood. Her delicate features, pale skin and button nose, so cute when she was younger, made her look washed out and tired in the grey light. Her happy-go-lucky side that had continued into adulthood had slowly been chipped away, making her wonder if she'd ever get that side of herself back. "I'm sorry I'm not there." Claudia's voice suddenly filled the quiet. "At least you have Howard with you." Molly glanced around her childhood bedroom and remained silent. The floorboards were bare, the furniture gone, the creaks and groans of the old house accentuated by its emptiness. Claudia made a knowing "huh" sound. "He's not there, is he?" "He needed to work." Of course he did. Claudia had used that tone many times before when talking about Howard, and it grated on Molly. "Not everyone can just take time off whenever they want, you know," Molly said cuttingly. She ran her fingers along the top of the fireplace. It had never been lit, and when she was little, she'd stored cuddly toys in the grate. In her teens, she'd swapped them for twinkling fairy lights. "I'm used to doing things on my own." If Claudia took offence to that, so be it. "Well, you'll be here soon enough. Proper quality family time." Claudia trailed off. A lump caught in Molly's throat. She knew what they were both thinking, just how much their family had changed, losing both of their parents within a year of each other. Molly didn't want to focus on any of that now. Selling the family home was the last of the past. She couldn't wait for today to be over, despite a part of her wanting to never let go of Ashford House and the memories it held. "We can't wait to see you," Claudia continued gently. "The kids are actually really excited about Christmas for once. Even Finn, who's way too old for all that festive nonsense. I think the last couple of years have made us all appreciate what's important. Spending time with family being top of the list. I can't wait to see you all too. This whole house sale has dragged on for so long. I hadn't anticipated I'd still be dealing with this so close to Christmas." Although she was on the phone, Molly wafted her hand around as she headed on to the landing, swallowing tears at the thought she hadn't lived at home for a good 15 years, and yet... "Are you okay, Moll?" "No." "Yes," she breathed deeply. "I'm focusing on the 18th, getting to Iceland and seeing you all." "It will do us all good," Claudia agreed. "And we'll get to celebrate your birthday too. It'll be nice to have happy things to focus on." Molly hummed in reply as she headed for the stairs, but paused to glance back along the landing, dimly lit in the grey December light. "I'd better go. I've got to be out of here by midday before the removers and the new family arrive. I just wanted to see it one last time." "Of course." Was there a hint of sorrow in Claudia's voice? She couldn't tell. "We'll see you in 10 days. It's not long." Molly said goodbye and clutched her phone to her chest. At least there was Iceland to focus on. How she would manage to feel festive, get through Christmas, or feel like celebrating her 35th birthday was a whole other matter. But seeing her sister, her brother-in-law, niece and nephew, and immersing herself in the joyfulness and adventure of being back in the land of fire and ice was sorely needed. Instead of going downstairs, Molly headed to the room at the far end of the hallway. It was the only room she hadn't looked in. Why she was putting herself through it, she had no idea. But she felt compelled to. Once a guest room, it had been turned into a bedroom and a haven for her mum when she deteriorated too much to get up and downstairs safely. Molly had filled the room with plants, books and pictures to take away the clinicalness of the adjustable hospital bed, the hoist and the portable toilet. It was the room in which her mum had taken her last breath, the room in which Molly had said her final goodbye. The emptiness where only the stirrings of sad memories remained was heartbreaking. Molly steeled herself, whispered, "Goodbye," and closed the door firmly on the past. She went downstairs, through the kitchen that had always been filled with life, and out into the once beautiful garden. Even overgrown and in the depths of winter, the magic remained. Molly's eyes traced the borders, the purple heather catching her eye. She plucked a handful of fronds and with a deep breath of fresh cold air, returned inside. Clutching the heather to her chest, she marched along the empty hallway, tears blurring her vision, a sob ready to erupt as she took a quick final glance in each room. Their bareness mirrored her own feeling of desolation, making her question if she'd ever be happy again, and shut it behind her for the very last time. Chapter 2. Tears streamed down Molly's face as she drove through the picture-perfect Cotswold village she knew so well. Even the Christmas trees glinting in cottage windows did little to raise her spirits. The church where her parents were buried was on the edge of the village, a serene and peaceful place, its Cotswold stone casting a golden hue among the winter-tinged greens and browns of the churchyard. The place held happy memories too. It was where Claudia had married Elva on a sunny spring day 22 years before, when 12-year-old Molly had revelled in being a bridesmaid. Molly had visited during all the seasons, but it felt particularly bleak today as she laid the heather on the grave. There was so much she wanted to say, but emotion choked her. There was nothing good she could tell them, so she remained quiet, silent tears running freely down her cold cheeks. Despite the ache in her heart, the 40-minute drive back to Cheltenham allowed her the time to process her feelings. It was a journey she'd driven on nearly a daily basis for months on end when her mum was ill. She'd stayed over most weekends, particularly after her dad had died of a heart attack just 4 months after her mum's terminal diagnosis. Molly swiped angrily at her face, wiping away the tears. She knew she couldn't continue to torture herself, reflecting on the sad events like this. Everything had been leading up to today. Saying goodbye to the family home had closed the door on the past. It was time to move on and focus on the future. Her and Howard's period townhouse on a leafy street in Cheltenham was very different to her parents' sprawling mid-17th century house. It was home, though, even if she'd spent far less time here than she'd wanted to recently. It was also a house she and Howard could grow into. With 3 bedrooms, there was enough space for a family. Not that they'd explicitly talked about it. They hadn't even got to the point of discussing getting married, and a proposal from Howard seemed a distant dream, but she'd occasionally imagine what their future would look like. Buying a house together had been commitment enough, and both of them were busy. Howard mostly with work, while the last couple of years for Molly had been spent juggling her own work, supporting her parents, and dealing with her grief. Unlike the empty shell of Ashford House, her house was filled with belongings, and yet somehow it felt just as empty. Molly put it down to her mood. With Howard at work and the heating on low, she shivered in the dark hallway. Feeling the need to fill the space and rid herself of the gloom, she bustled about, switching on lights and the radio. Chris Rear's driving home for Christmas. There were no Christmas decorations up. Normally, Molly would have decorated the house by the beginning of December, but 8 days in, and the Christmas box remained in the loft. The last 2 Christmases had been consumed by sadness as well. Last year, it had been their turn to spend it with Howard's parents, and after the loss of her own parents and with Claudia in Iceland, there had been no reason not to. Molly had gone through the motions, pretending to be okay while breaking down in private. The Christmas before that at Ashford House had been the last with her mum and the first without her dad, all of them reeling from her dad's devastating heart attack just a few weeks before. Even with Howard, Claudia and her family there, it had taken all of Molly's resolve to put on a brave face and give everyone the best Christmas possible. Molly had felt adrift in a house that had no longer felt like a home, and her mum had been overcome with grief from the sudden loss of her husband and deeply depressed by the rapid progression of the motor neuron disease, cruelly consuming her body. Molly stopped her thoughts in their tracks. Although her grief counsellor had suggested it would be good to think back on painful times to try and process her feelings, it wasn't helpful today. She knew the grieving process was long and often unexpected. So many times a wave of sadness would hit, often after she'd been feeling upbeat for a while, as if toying with her, whispering in its cruel little voice, "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" She couldn't allow her thoughts to spiral like this. She'd made a promise to herself to look forward rather than back on events she couldn't change. After forcing herself to eat a sandwich and at a loss for what to do, Molly reflected that taking the whole day off work might not have been the wisest idea. She needed to escape, to clear her head and let all of the upset ebb away before Howard got home. She drove out of Cheltenham to Line Over Wood, parked up and put on wellies before navigating the well-trodden muddy paths. Pale winter sun strained through swirls of white cloud, the patchy blue sky beyond the bare tree branches just as insipid. Where the sun hadn't reached, frosted leaves crunched underfoot, a satisfying sound against the constant background noise of traffic on the A40. Going to Iceland felt like a slice of normality, a chance to try to forget and move on from her heartache while immersing herself in fun and adventure. The idea seemed out of kilter with how she was feeling and everything she'd been through, but Claudia's life had continued, looking after and entertaining guests at their Icelandic lodge, so perhaps Molly's guilt wouldn't surface while there. On the rare occasion Molly had gone out with friends over the last year, her grief, she desperately hoped she'd feel differently in Iceland. The pacey walk and the refreshingly chill air, if damp and rather miserable by the time she made it back to the car, did at least revive her, even if it didn't erase the sadness. She switched on the engine and let the car warm up as she stared in the rear-view mirror at her red-rimmed eyes, smudged eyeliner and tear tracks down her cheeks. She wiped away the evidence before heading back. Howard would be home soon. He wasn't. Not that it was unusual for him to be late, but his phone call an hour after he should have got home did nothing to make her feel any better. "So sorry, Moll. Things got hectic at work, sorting out an issue, and I didn't have time to call," or apparently text. "That's okay," her way of saying, "I'm used to it. Are you on your way back now?" "About that." Molly held in a resigned sigh, but she did wonder if Howard would hear the upset in her voice. "I was hoping we could get a takeaway and watch a movie, take my mind off things. Sorry, I completely forgot I'd said yes to having a drink with Darren. He's in a really bad place at the moment with his crazy ex-wife and custody issues with his kids." He paused. Molly wondered if he was turning over what he'd just said. Yes, other people's lives were shit too, but even so, today of all days. "Look, we'll do something tomorrow evening. I'll book that French bistro you love. I won't be home too late, I promise." Molly couldn't help but think he was avoiding her. She didn't say that, though. She never said what she was really thinking, at least not recently. "Are you okay, though?" Howard's voice interrupted her thoughts. Finally, he was asking after her. "I'm fine," she said firmly, as if saying it with such certainty would make it true. "Just been a bit emotional, that's all." Now that was an understatement, but it was all she was willing to say, at least over the phone. The last thing she wanted after the day she'd had was a confrontation. Better to let it slide. They said goodbye instead. She was desperate for company, though, for a hug and for someone to tell her it was all okay, even if it wasn't. And she was certain the real reason he was going out was less about being a sounding board for his mate, and more because he didn't know how to deal with her and her sadness. He'd found it hard over the last couple of years. Of course he had. Life had been far from a bundle of laughs. Claudia's earlier comment about Howard not being at the house twisted in her mind. To be fair, she hadn't explicitly asked him to be there, yet she'd hoped he'd offer. If it had crossed his mind that she'd need his support and company on one of the... Him being there with her would have meant everything. To know he cared, to know he had a small understanding of just how hard it had been. Yet another goodbye. Once again, she cut her thoughts short. No, she wasn't going to go down that road this evening. She wasn't going to cry her eyes out again. She scrolled through Deliveroo, but her appetite had deserted her. It would have been different if they'd been eating together. Cooking was her passion, and normally an escape. But recently it had felt like a chore, so she raided the fridge instead and found a bowl of leftover macaroni cheese. After changing into her pyjamas and snuggling beneath a throw on the sofa, her thoughts strayed to Howard and what had become of their relationship. When was the last time they'd done something together that hadn't involved a work do or mutual friends? Something nice and romantic. Something where they were able to spend time together. She'd see if his promise of dinner out tomorrow evening materialised. When was the last time they'd had sex? Molly scrunched her nose. She honestly couldn't remember. How awful was that? There was always an excuse, and it wasn't just her not being in the mood. She couldn't even remember the last time he'd properly held her. Everything had been pushed away to deal with later. Her emotions, her grief, her relationship. Absolutely everything. Escaping to Iceland for 2 weeks with Howard, far from the reality and stress of home, was what they desperately needed. The thought had kept her going for months. Claudia had suggested it when she'd come over in the summer to help sort through the house, and Molly had jumped at the chance. The idea of her and Howard spending Christmas at home or going to his parents again because hers were no longer around had filled her with fear. This Christmas needed to be different, and she was determined it would be. In an attempt to make herself feel festive, Molly watched Love Actually, but all it did was make her cry, both the sad and happy parts. Yet the underlying message of giving yourself a chance at happiness and the importance of loved ones left her with a renewed feeling of hope. After focusing all her love and energy on her parents and the aftermath of losing them, it was time to put herself first, to piece her heart back together as much as her damaged relationship with Howard. He messaged when he was on his way back, but she decided not to wait up. Not only was she emotionally drained and physically wrung out, but she'd gone past wanting to talk to him, for tonight at least. Apart from briefly talking to her sister, she'd dealt with the day by herself. If she'd wanted to, she had close friends she could have called. They'd messaged earlier, asking how it had gone, and she'd replied with a simple, "Glad it's over." It was impossible to put into words the... As she wiped away her makeup and brushed her teeth, she imagined the new family doing the same in her parents' old bathroom with its creaky floorboards and roll-top bath. The icy air seeping in through the window. A young family would fill the rooms with laughter and much-needed happiness. For them, it would be an exciting new chapter, just as this chapter of Molly's life was finishing. She heard Howard come in, but he didn't come upstairs straight away. She wondered if he was trying to avoid her as much as she was avoiding him, because that was what she was doing now. She'd already decided to pretend to be asleep when he came to bed. As it turned out, he took so long, she didn't have to pretend. There was little time to chat to Howard before work in the morning, as he was up and out early. For so long, her focus had been on Ashford House. That with the sale having finally gone through, she felt lost. At least she had work to take her mind off things, even if it felt as if she was going through the motions. Working as an HR manager for a large entertainment group was a job she knew inside and out, which was just as well, given how little she'd focused on it recently. Howard stayed true to his word and booked the restaurant. Molly had been there a few times before, but only once with Howard. She was pleased he'd remembered how much she'd liked it, even if it felt odd being out alone together. They'd met through mutual friends 7 years ago and used to have so much to talk about. But back then they'd been carefree, bonding over a shared love of crime dramas, live comedy and paddleboarding. Now it was an effort to find something to say beyond the sad events of recent years. They ordered and chatted about work and Howard's promotion at the beginning of the year to senior project manager. Safe and easy subjects as they shared a bottle of Sancerre. By the time they'd finished their starters and their mains of chicken ballantine with wild mushrooms and moule marinière were brought out, they'd run out of topics to talk about. When had things got so awkward? They were out of practice, Molly reasoned, both at going out and spending time together. They used to enjoy spontaneous weekends away paddleboarding in Devon or having cocktails with friends in London. Sunday mornings used to be spent lazing in bed, having sex and chatting about anything and everything before Molly would make brunch, experimenting with new recipes to try out on Howard. Perhaps it was best to acknowledge the awkwardness rather than ignore it. "It'll be good to go away together after so long," Molly finally said to fill the growing silence. The reason why they hadn't been away together remained heavy and unspoken between them. Their lives had diverged. Howard had gone on a staff, while Molly's life had revolved around her parents and then their house. It was strange to be able to think of herself for once, not just herself, her and Howard. "I can't think further ahead than the next day at the moment." Howard loosened his tie and stabbed a muscle with his fork. "I have too much work on that needs my focus." Molly bit her lip. She felt the opposite. Yes, work had been a good distraction and escape, while keeping busy had been an essential part of her being able to function. But she didn't love her job. She didn't live for work like Howard did. Her ambition and dreams had been put on hold, and she was desperate to focus on Christmas and Iceland. She needed to focus on something positive, something she was actually looking forward to. Howard reached across the table and put his hand on hers. She met his hazel eyes, which were framed by thick, dark eyebrows that always made him look serious. Perhaps he sensed her upset. "Honestly, I am looking forward to Christmas. There's just lots to do beforehand." "I know, I'm sorry." Molly dropped her eyes, focusing on his neat nails and the dark hair on his fingers as she pushed the remains of her crispy-skinned, succulent chicken around her plate. She didn't want to show her disappointment about his lack of excitement for their upcoming trip. "It's just, for me, for the first time in, well, what feels like forever, I'm actually looking forward to something. Selling the house and sorting out that side of things has been all-consuming, and it feels a little like a weight has been lifted, you know?" "Yeah, I get it." Did he, though? "You've had a shitty couple of years," he continued, "so you absolutely deserve to get excited about seeing your family again." "Okay, good. As long as you don't mind me banging on about it." She smiled tentatively. She knew she struggled to talk to him about losing her parents. But if she couldn't talk about something as uplifting as Iceland with him, what else did they have to talk about? "It's hard to believe it's been nearly 3 years since I was last there," Molly sighed. "And that was in spring. I can't even remember the last time we went in winter." "That Christmas before we bought our house. Snowmobiling with Elvar was pretty cool." "Oh, I remember. Finn was adamant he was going to lead the trip, but he was only 14 at the time." Molly smiled at the memory of her headstrong nephew. Even back then he was capable, although his dad Elvar had been right not to give him free rein, at least when there were guests around. "That was my highlight of Iceland." Howard finished his last mouthful of moule marinière. "Maybe we can do it again this time." Howard ran his hand down his clean-shaven cheeks and crinkled his lips. Not that Molly was convinced by her own suggestion either. 4 years ago, she jumped at the chance to snowmobile across Lankjogurt Glacier. It wasn't that she'd mellowed, it was just her adventurous side had slowly been sucked from her with responsibility and uncertainty. The idea of soaking in the Blue Lagoon appealed more than bombing it across a glacier far from civilization. Molly took a final bite of the chicken ballantine, relishing the flavour and promising herself to try the recipe out at home. She put down her knife and fork and looked at Howard. "I'm going to go into town tomorrow, get some more thermal socks. Do you need anything? I know you're focused on work, but time's running out if you need anything extra. It's going to be absolutely freezing, you realise?" Still clasping his wine, he met her eyes, his mouth pursed and nose wrinkled. "About that, you know what I said before about work?" Molly's heart sank. She had a horrible feeling she knew what was coming. "I understand you're busy," she cut in before he could say anything else. "But they can't expect you to work over Christmas. So what's the problem?" "The 18th is too early. I did tell you this when we were booking the tickets. The flight on the 22nd would have been better. It would have meant only having to take a couple of days off that way." Molly frowned. "Well, I'm sorry. It's too late now." "It's not, actually. I checked." He held her gaze as he put his wine down. "There are still seats and only an admin fee to pay to amend the booking." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to work, so I've changed the ticket and will fly out on the Thursday instead." "You've already done it and didn't think to discuss it with me first?" "I didn't want to risk losing the seat. It's only 4 days later." He shrugged as if it was nothing. "Let Claudia know. I'm sure it would be good for you guys to spend some time together without me. You're always going on about how little you see of each other. This is the perfect solution." "For you, maybe." Molly held her tongue. If he'd wanted to, he would have talked to her. What he'd done was taken away her say in the matter. They'd once been a team. An extra time away together would have trumped staying home to work. But then lots had changed. Her appetite for pudding deserted her. What upset her the most was the tiny part of her that was relieved to have a bit of time in Iceland without him. A few days where she wouldn't have to worry if he was enjoying himself, if he and Claudia were getting on, or where she'd have to consider what to say and how to act around him. It was crazy, she knew, to feel this way, which was why the time away to focus on their neglect, she just had a few days' grace first to focus on herself and her sister. Chapter 3. Molly packed away her worries about Howard having to work and his delay in joining her in Iceland, but the niggling feeling of uncertainty about their relationship gnawed at her subconscious. Although, with the last-minute shopping to fit in between work and packing, there wasn't much time to dwell. Going away for 2 weeks over Christmas and New Year meant she had extra to do at work, and it seemed Howard was being truthful about how busy he was, getting home even later than she did most days. One of them would cook, and they'd eat together in front of the TV watching Line of Duty, which of course meant they didn't actually have to talk to each other. Any conversation they did have was about work, what they were watching, and getting Christmas presents to family and friends. Perfunctory, boring chatter. She wanted to remind him of the times when their relationship had been filled with laughter and fun, when they couldn't keep their hands off each other, and they were excited about the future. But she didn't know how to begin. What worried her was not really knowing how Howard felt. Did he feel the same, bored and stuck in a rut? She made a silent promise to spend the holiday together concentrating on getting the spark back. With her 35th birthday looming, she was aware that time wasn't on her side. She needed to be brave and initiate the conversation about their future, about starting a family, and she would, as soon as they were in Iceland. Molly's last day of work soon came round, and the Saturday was spent washing and packing. The Sunday flight was early, but Howard's decision to go separately had messed up the logistics. He insisted she still drove, and he would get a friend to take him to the airport. After a fitful sleep, Molly woke before the alarm and tried not to disturb Howard as she got dressed in the dark. She crept into the bathroom to clean her teeth, splash water on her face, and put on a bit of makeup before heading downstairs. Her suitcase and rucksack were already packed and in the hallway. As she made a flask of coffee for her journey, a second alarm went off, and she heard Howard drag himself out of bed. With a jumper thrown over his pajamas, he joined her in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye." He gave her a hug and kissed her gently. "Thank you." She really meant it, because the gesture was unexpected but welcome. Howard slipped on his trainers and dragged her suitcase outside while she hefted the rucksack on her back. It was 3:45 on a Sunday morning, quiet and dark apart from the streetlights. Fine drizzle made it feel colder than it probably was, and Molly was glad of her insulated coat with its faux fur-trimmed hood. Knowing she'd get hot, she wouldn't be outside for long. They loaded the luggage in the boot, and Molly turned to Howard. He was shivering, his dark hair already damp, his eyes just black pools in the dim light. "Go on in before you get soaked." Molly gave him another hug, holding on until he let go. "See you on the 22nd. Don't work too hard." "I'll try not to." "Safe flight." He faltered, as if to say something more, but then gave a weak smile and headed up the garden path. Molly shrugged out of her coat, slipped into the car and started the engine. As she reached for her seatbelt, she went to wave at Howard, but he'd already gone. The porch light switched off, shrouding the front garden in darkness. "I did tell him to go inside," she reflected as she pulled away. What had she expected? For him to stand shivering in the doorway blowing kisses? At one time, perhaps, yes. Molly turned the heater up, put the radio on, and headed for the M5 and Bristol Airport. Cocooned in the window seat with her coat over her lap like a blanket, Molly yawned, desperate for sleep but only managing snatched moments with her head lolling against her blow-up pillow. The hushed but excited chatter of the couple next to her kept disturbing her. She gathered it was their first time to Iceland and they were celebrating their first wedding anniversary with a whirlwind few days. When she did finally nod off, the refreshment trolley wheeled by, waking her again. What she was conscious about, as she tucked into a nondescript toastie, was that she was alone, which was accentuated by the loved-up couple. It was a feeling that had weaved around her for months on end. Thinking back, she wasn't really sure when it had started, but her mum's diagnosis had been the catalyst. Any spare time had been spent caring for and being with her mum. Not that she resented it one bit, but she'd neglected Howard. Although it hadn't been down to just her, they'd both neglected their relationship. Was Claudia right, though? Had Howard always let her down? She shouldn't feel lonely, not when her sister would be meeting her in Reykjavik. She'd soon be ensconced in the warm embrace of her Icelandic family, but it was hard to not be disappointed over Howard's decision, even if she would see him again in a few days. It wasn't as if this was the first time he'd changed their plans at the last minute. Molly finished her toastie and cupped her hands around her hot coffee. The woman next to her kept leaning closer, trying to peer out of the window. Molly smiled at her. "We're sitting on the right side of the plane to see the south coast as we fly in." The woman swallowed her mouthful of food. "You've been before then?" Molly nodded. "Many times. My sister lives in Iceland with her family. They run a friendly boutique lodge specialising in small..." "That sounds wonderful. We're staying in Reykjavik, but have a Golden Circle and South Coast Adventure Tour booked. I hope they're the best things to do." "To be honest, any of it is," Molly shrugged. "It's truly wonderful in winter, with the guarantee of a white Christmas. Oh, we'll be home by then, but the whole trip is putting us in the festive spirit." Holidays in Iceland had been a part of Molly's life ever since Claudia had moved there to live with Leifur. After university, Claudia had taken a gap year and travelled all over the world, but her week in Iceland had changed her life. Leifur had been one of the guides on a 3-day adventure tour Claudia had taken from Reykjavik, and by the time they'd returned to the city, they'd fallen in love, and Claudia had never left, except to briefly return to the UK to pack up and move out of the family home. Molly had visited at every time of the year. But there was something extra special about winter. The dull, drizzly day they'd left behind continued as they flew north. The Atlantic Ocean was whale grey and rough, peaked with flurries of ash-white foam. The wild remoteness was what made Iceland so special, and as they neared the coast, Molly crammed herself to the side of the window, allowing the couple their first glimpse of Iceland. The black sand beaches that studded the southern coast were stark against the white snow that spread inland. The golden glimmer of the wintry sun made the ice glow. She usually felt uplifted arriving in Iceland, the magic never having dispersed since the first time she'd visited. But that spark had been lost this time, not because of the place itself. She didn't think she'd ever take the desolate beauty for granted, but because life had worn her down. Everything felt an effort, even the idea of talking to her sister, brother-in-law, niece and nephew. Maybe it would be different when she saw them. Apart from her sister, the last time she'd seen Elvar, Finn and Alda was at her mum's funeral 14 months ago. Not only did it feel longer than that, but the time they'd all spent together had been fueled by sadness and her own stress at being responsible for organising it all. Would she felt differently if Howard had been sitting next to her? She wasn't sure, but she was disappointed by his decision and certain that when he did arrive, having time together and embracing all the delights Iceland had to offer would do them good. The plane changed course, heading away from the snarling foam-tipped waves and inland across the snow, leaving behind the smudge of black edging the island as they began to make their descent. Freezing air blasted Molly as she stepped outside the airport terminal and pulled on her hat and thermal gloves. The hit of cold was bracing, a reminder of happy times when she'd been here before, days filled, then summer hikes when the white landscape dramatically changed to moss-covered terrain, the greens vivid against black rock and grey mountainous backdrops. Long days spent outside would be rewarded with cosy evenings in. Even in summer, the fires were lit at Claudia and Elvar's aptly named the Fire Lodge, and the midnight sun would keep them company as family and guests would tuck in to home-cooked food, washed down with home-brewed beer. Molly craved that hygge vibe at home, but somehow missed the mark, whereas her sister and brother-in-law had nailed it. The flybus was warm and filled with the chatter of holidaymakers. The drive from Keflavik Airport to Reykjavik was familiar to Molly, the landscape blanketed with snow, only an occasional rock poking through, its stark black surface disturbing the uniform white. Then they passed blocks of square buildings, the splashes of red and yellow surprising among the muted white and grey. The gusty wind churned the sea, grey peaks rolling towards the shore, hidden by banks of snow. Molly wondered what Howard was doing, and if he was working today, rushing to get everything finished before joining her. She messaged him to let him know she'd arrived safely and was on her way to meet Claudia. The closer they got to Reykjavik, the more upbeat she began to feel. The relief at finally being back in Iceland and about to see her sister immense. As the bus pulled into the station, she spotted Claudia leaning against the side of her solid black 4x4. Claudia was tall and wiry and had studied sport science. She always had been active, and her life in Iceland had only fueled her love for sport and the outdoors. A head shorter, Molly was slender but curvier, her passion lying in creative pursuits such as art and cooking, although she had reluctantly done a business studies degree. Both sisters were drawn to wild, open spaces, though, happiest trekking for miles before heading home to tuck into a home-cooked meal. The other thing they had in common was their chestnut hair. Claudia's pixie cut was now flecked with grey, while Molly's was long with a choppy fringe. Molly's happiness at seeing her big sister overwhelmed her, momentarily pushing away the grief as they hugged each other. Not only were they different in looks and personality, but the divide of 11 years made her sister sometimes feel more like an aunt. They hadn't really grown up together either. By the time Molly was 7, Claudia had gone off to university. In many respects, she'd grown up as an only child, just as her sister had done in the 11 years before Molly was born. Molly shed happy tears, while Claudia's cry of, "It's so good to see you," rang into the icy air. But Molly felt warm and safe as she gazed out of the window on the short drive from the bus terminal to the centre. Although Claudia and her family lived a 45-minute drive outside of Reykjavik, the city was familiar from numerous visits. With snow everywhere, the winter light was soft even in the middle of the day. The sun had only risen a little after 11 and would be making its descent later that afternoon. The trees in front of the houses lining the far side of the frozen lakes were lit with tiny warm lights that glimmered in the half-light. "We're going to the usual place?" Molly asked as they parked in a quiet side road. "Of course." Claudia crunched through the snow and joined her on the pavement. She hooked her arm in Molly's and they set off towards the busier heart of the city. It was a fully functioning winter wonderland with the roads clear of snow in the centre and piles of pristine white coating everything else. Molly knew if this much snow fell in Cheltenham, everything would grind to a halt. It was a few degrees below freezing, but the wind chill made it even colder as specks of snow drifted and the icy wind twisted around Molly. She had long socks on beneath her jeans, but she wished she was wearing the thermals that were packed in her suitcase. It was a short but brisk walk to the cafe, past festive shop windows and the typical corrugated iron-clad buildings, which were colourful in the gloom, with warm light spilling from windows and trees entwined with lights. Molly couldn't help but feel revitalised at being here, particularly in winter, when everywhere seemed even more beautiful and otherworldly. She envied Claudia's lifestyle. Molly often felt as if she'd missed her chance to shake up her life, particularly in recent years. It had fallen to Molly to support her parents and look after her mum alongside the carers, because she was the one close by. While Molly had been juggling her mum's hospital appointments with her own job, Claudia had been taking guests out on adventurous glacier hikes or horse riding to breathtakingly beautiful waterfalls. But however hard it had been, Molly had been there for her mum unconditionally and would be so again in a heartbeat. She would treasure that time forever, and despite the painful loss, there was relief too that her mum was now at peace. Molly's jealousy of her sister's unique life had seeded itself long before her own life had been consumed by supporting her parents, though it had always been easier to visit them in Iceland than for Claudia's family to come to the UK, and they only did when they shut down the lodge for a couple of weeks in early spring and occasionally over Christmas. Even if they didn't leave Iceland often, their whole life was an adventure. Molly's job helped pay the bills, and she and Howard had a nice house in a decent, never thrown all caution to the wind and done anything as exciting or dramatic as her sister. It was about time she took inspiration from Claudia and changed that. Chapter 4. The Reykjavik street food cafe on Rainbow Street was compact, with a couple of tables squeezed next to the ground floor window. Molly and Claudia timed it perfectly, with people leaving just as they arrived. They were welcomed and Claudia chatted in Icelandic to the man behind the counter, while Molly settled herself by the window, looking out at the colourful rainbow stripes that ran the length of the pedestrianised street. Only a couple of minutes after Claudia sat down, 2 cardboard trays with crispy fried fish and chips were placed in front of them, along with 2 cups of coffee. For as long as Molly could remember, it had been a tradition to eat here whenever they were in Reykjavik. Claudia squeezed lemon over her fish, stabbed her fork into it, and grinned at Molly. "I'm so glad you're here." With a mouthful of moist, fresh fish and tasty batter, Molly nodded in agreement. The tension after months and months of heartache and grief hadn't completely abated, but the coil in her stomach began to loosen a little as they chatted about Finn and Alda and the plans Claudia and Elvar had for them and their guests over the festive period. As jobs went, her sister and brother-in-law had the perfect work-life balance, managing to work hard and play hard. They didn't always keep the lodge open over Christmas, but this year it had been at the special request of 2 of the guests staying, and being the friendly and open people they were, they always included the guests in their festivities. Molly and Claudia had always had an interesting relationship. By the time Molly had reached adulthood, Her sister had made a life for herself away from Molly, their parents, and the UK. When university, dating, and having fun was at the forefront of Molly's mind, Claudia was focused on her marriage to Elvar, building their business and raising kids. Time with Claudia had been fleeting, usually in the form of holidays in Iceland, occasional ones in the UK, and then in recent times, bereavement had brought them together. Molly steered her thoughts away from the part of her life she couldn't change and watched the tourists outside, battling against the icy wind as, wrapped in winter coats, hats, gloves and scarves, they made their way up the street. She turned back to her tray of fish and chips and met Claudia's intense gaze from across the table. "Why is Howard not with you, Moll? Tell me honestly." Molly could barely look her sister in the eye. Claudia had never warmed to him, for whatever reason. Molly had always sensed that her sister had never thought he was good enough for her, and once again, he'd let her down and proved Claudia right.